watching The Producer's Room, a streaming web series featuring the creators behind the hit songs of today's music industry. Songwriters, music producers, and artists discuss their creative process as well as examining current issues and technologies in today's rapidly changing music business. Your host is producer, songwriter, and educator Dave Tuff. Welcome to The Producer's Room. Session drummer and live drummer, Nashville drummer extraordinaire. Eb has graciously agreed to help us today. Eb, what's up with your drums being different colors?
I call them jelly beans.
Oh, cool, man. So we're going to do a bunch of experiments, thankfully, with Eb's participation. We're appreciative of it, and we're going to start with the kick and then do some overheads and some toms and all that. Tell us what, just so the audience knows, what types of drums. At least I know we're going to switch snare drums, but at least your toms and kick drum.
Well, what I have right here is these three drums here are fives, and they're called the Austin era.
Uh-huh.
So the shells were produced and manufactured by a company called Jasper.
Cool. Which
is also the same manufacturer for Gretsch shells. This happens to be an actual Gretsch tom.
Uh-huh.
Just recently had got on eBay and then had a guy here in Nashville do some modifications.
It's birch too?
Customizing. Nope, all maple.
Oh, maple. Okay.
Maple. It's a combination of maple and gum wood.
Oh, so they're both layered on top of each other?
Yeah, they're. I don't know which order they're in, but I think it's like maple, gum, maple.
Cool.
Something like that.
And then what about the edges? Like, did you have any work on the edges?
When the same guy that redid this one, when I got these, he redid these, and because I'm such a big fan of Gretsch, I just went ahead and asked him to cut the edges, brand new edges.
So when you
of like a Gretsch.
So when you cut it like that, is it like a certain angle or?
Yeah, it's a 30-degree angle.
Cool.
The wood slightly more contact with the head.
Yeah.
Which generally means you get more set tone of the wood and tends to be a little bit warmer.
Cool.
Whereas sharp 45s tend to be much more, more, I don't say piercing, but they're not as kind of
more attacky, but less tone or something. Yeah. And then tell me, I know we're going to switch out cymbals, so we'll talk about that later, but tell me what type of heads you have on your main drums here.
I am a die-hard Remo user.
Cool.
And I always, if I always can, try and use coated ambassadors on tops. And I use clear ambassadors on the bottom.
Yeah, I think that's...
The bass drum has a Power Stroke 3, and then the front is just a regular coated ambassador.
Cool, man. Well, we'll be back with you here in just a minute, so thanks. Okay, so this is the beginnings of our first session that we're going to test a bunch of ideas on. On the overheads, first we're trying our ribbon setups. We're doing two overhead pairs. We're doing a pair of Coles equidistant from the snare drum, the Coles 4038, number 1, number 2, audience perspective, left and right. We're doing an AEA R88 as overhead 2. On the toms, we're actually miking top and bottom. We didn't have enough 421s for top and bottom, so we're doing a 441 on the bottom, flipping the phase on each of the three toms there. And then we're going to go through different snare drums as we do this. We got a couple different, experimental mics here. We got the RE20 pointed at the kit, and since Eb is a lefty, it's kind of pointed towards the tom on that side. We got a condenser right there, KM84, pointed towards kind of the snare drum hi-hat area. And then we have, like we had yesterday, a trash mic there, compressed through 1176. We got a FET 47 with pop screen there. Like I said, you can see that RE20 over there again. Then the rooms, trying something new. What are those called, Ed? Those are called Ashman acoustics. Supposed to be like M50's Omni mics for the room. So we're trying those. We're trying a cruddy mic of mine. And that'll be there. And then we got a floor 87 and a wall 87 pointed towards the wall cardioid. So overall, that is our first round of setups. We're going to go through a few snare drums using this setup, and that's it. Welcome to round one of our full drum shootout. If you'd watched the other two portions of Dave's Waves, we had shot out inside kick mics, outside kick mics, and snare drum top and bottom microphones. Or actually, I think we just did snare top, but this time we're going to add the bottom, and we're going to add all the other miscellaneous pieces and parts of the drum set. So we are assuming that, we have enough inputs to do all this, which we did, and if you guys were wondering, I think we explain it, that we did go through a API style console, 312 style pre's, and we went into an Apogee Symphony converter, but no EQ, and a few items here have compression, and I will talk about that here in a minute. So our favorite shootout mic from the kicks were the Audix D6 and the Beta 52, but we decided on the Audix D6 since it did have that nice little smiley face. Eb is doing similar grooves on all these particular takes, Eb, our drummer, so we can compare apples and apples. But let's go ahead and listen to the Audix D6, and I'll kind of just go down through this, give you a tutorial of what we did. You saw some of it in the intro video. So here's the D6. So once again, nice little click, but some low end, but not a lot of low end. And the reason not a lot of low end, like maybe the Beta 52 gave us more low end, was because we decided upon the FET47 for the out kick mic. Reason being, primarily, is because it gave the most low end, and it didn't give a tone like the sub kick. I'd been using a sub kick for a long time, but I noticed on this particular session that it really gave a tone that I wasn't digging. So going back to the FET47, which I used to use, everything comes in circles, right? So let's go ahead and add the FET47 in while we're listening to the Audix. And you'll notice if you're listening on full range speakers, not earbuds or anything, that it's going to add a lot more low end to a particular kick sound here. And here we go, let's add it in. Now it is hard because volume can fool you, and we did have these, remember, from our first episode of Dave's Waves, or second episode on drums, that we did have these phase aligned using the radial phase alignment tool. So it is going to get louder when I add it in, but what you should also notice is that it gets fuller, especially in the low end. Now the only complaint I might have with the FET47 as an outkick mic, because it does have some bleed in there. You can go ahead and low pass it if you want to get rid of some of that. It's not awful for me. It doesn't bug me. So we just left it as is. So those are two kick mics. From our shootout on the snare top, I was really digging the Beyer 201 only because it gave this nice little low mids boost that like a 57 I just never got from a 57. So never used a Beyer 201 too much. I've used it on a few sessions in the past, but I think I'm going to start using it more now because I really do like that low mid boost that it gives. I'll let you hear the Beyer. And almost like a cool little natural compression in there as well. I mean, which any dynamic's going to give you, but especially this Beyer, it's nice. It's not compressed, and it kind of sounds compressed to my ears, which is pretty cool for rock and country styles. So that was what we went for to get that kind of low MIDI thing with the Beyer 201. Then we actually ended up using this El Cheapo mic I have, the MXL 991 made by Marshall. That you can get a pair from Guitar Center pretty darn cheap. I did have the transformers switched out by Jim Williams, so maybe some Burr Browns in there, but overall this mic is fairly reasonable price wise, and what we found this mic gave us is a lot more top end or brightness. So when you compare that mic, let's go ahead and just go to solo mode. One's kind of dark and one's kind of bright, basically, is what it comes down to. So you can mix those two together. And so I'd probably go somewhere starting around there. I wasn't paying attention to peaking, but somewhere around there just for our shootout here. And get a nice mix of those two particular mics together, however we want those. The MXL 991 is a small diaphragm condenser. I forgot to mention that, versus the Beyer's a small diaphragm dynamic. So was digging that over the 57, so we went with this particular combination. The one other thing I would say that I really liked about the Beyer is it is hypercardioid. So it has a good amount of rejection. The MXL, not as much. With the hi-hat, you can still hear some hi-hat in there. But not awful. Okay, on this particular round, round one, which we're investigating right now, we used an SM57 for the bottom mic. Once again, not a mic choice I would have typically gone for. I usually go for a condenser on the bottom snares, but I was digging it this time only because of the rejection. I could have used a Beyer as well. We actually shot it out with the Beyer, and I went with the SM57 on the bottom snare. I'll let you hear that, what it kind of sounds like. Now it is picking up some kick drum I can hear. But it was a little bit more consistent than what a condenser was. It's not going to give you the high frequencies a condenser is going to give you, but we just really weren't missing those, maybe because of the MXL. So that's what we went with on round one. Let me let you hear all three snare drums back together as one. So if I want more beef, I turn up the Beyer. If I want more high end, turn up the MXL, etc., etc. On the hat, we went with an SM7 on the hat. So I'm actually going to skip around and let you hear some different hats real quick. I'll skip between the rounds. So the first round we used a SM7 on the hat. There we go. Some hi-hat. So you'll notice the SM7 has a good amount of rejection, and it also adds a lot of beef to the hi-hat. So if you're looking for that John Bonham beefy hat sound, that is your mic. The next mic we went with, I'm just going to skip over here, is a KM84 small diaphragm condenser Neumann. Actually, it sounds a little close to me for my preference, a little close to the hi-hat. But what I didn't like about that in general is it just didn't seem to have the rejection that the SM7 did. Wasn't my favorite there. But let's go to round three and we'll hear an R121 Royer ribbon on the hat. Nice and dark, but once again, the rejection really wasn't my preference. So out of the three mics that we shot out on these particular rounds, I went with the SM7 as my favorite, but I'll let you decide your favorites. Okay, moving down the toms, we did 421s on the top toms, and that's usually all I do on toms is a 421 or a small diaphragm condenser like the E22S by Josephson or something like that. But just because of the mics we had on hand for this particular shootout, we went with 421s on the top, which are affordable mics. But then we actually also mic'd the bottom of the tom, and that's not something I do too much on sessions just because of input. But I do want you to hear what the bottom mics brought to the session. I was pretty surprised, to tell you the truth. So let's go ahead and I'll take a chunk here. Let's take the mid tom. right here, somewhere where I can loop it. And go ahead and solo the mid tom, make sure that's all we have. So here is just, and I'm going to get these equal. So we're comparing apples and apples, the bottom and the top mic. So top mic, bottom mic, it had the 441, which is a variation of the 421. You can look up the frequency responses online, but pretty close to each other. And we used 441s on the bottom of each toms, and we had 3 toms. So I want you to listen to the top here, and then I'm going to add in the bottom mic, and you can kind of listen to what it does. So let's go ahead and loop this. Hopefully this is a good little section here. 421 only. Add the bottom in. So you can definitely see, I mean, it does get louder once again, but, and by the way, mention that we should always mention that we flip the phase on the bottom mics, but it does get fuller in tone. I mean, it gets louder, but it gets fuller, and also there's more sustain on the toms. So I thought it was pretty cool, and that's definitely something that I'm going to do more of in the future if I do have the inputs. Let's try it again. I'll kind of bring it in and out so you can see. Just top. Bottom. So just fuller in general, you know. Let's try that on the low tom. Top only. With bottom. So on that particular one, there is some bleed from the snare drum. So that might be a consideration. I liked it more on the mid tom, but you can always get rid of that. And overall, I just thought it was a cool little option that I've not done a lot of, but I'm going to do more in the future. Okay, as far as overheads, I think on the intro video or intro part of this particular Dave's Waves, you saw how we set up the overheads. Round 1, we used the Coles 4038 ribbon mics in a space pair configuration. I would say it's probably close to what Steve Albini would do as far as like kind of right over the drum set, capturing the whole drum set as opposed to just cymbals. I've heard him say before he looks at the drum set all as just one instrument. So if you want to capture the entire instrument, not just the cymbals, that kind of space pair configuration is a pretty good one to go with. May have some phase issues, but we'll talk about how to avoid that in a minute. So let's go ahead and just listen to the Coles overheads, and I'm going to go ahead and create a group for these so I can solo them together. Overhead 1 and overhead 2. Okay, overhead 2. Cool. So I want you to listen to the Coles first, and they're panned. I'm not going to pan them too wide just because give an unrealistic perspective for the overheads, but I'll pan them somewhere in the middle here. So let's go ahead and play the Coles and get to a place where the drummer's playing time here. Okay, so nothing exciting, but I tell you the truth, I really liked the Coles as we went through the shootout, comparing them to the other overheads. I went and looked at the frequency response of the Coles, and I was really surprised how flat they were for a ribbon mic. Not only in the bottom end, because usually ribbon mics have this big boost in the bottom end, but also for the top end, they were just pretty darn flat all the way up until like 15K-ish. And you'll notice, like when he hit that crash in the middle of the section I just played, it didn't jump out. It stayed pretty even. So those are 2 things I really liked about the Coles. I mean, they're not going to rock your world as far as excitement, but they're just a darn good even mic, and that matters when you're trying to capture the drum set. The other thing we did was shoot it out with another ribbon, which is my ribbon, the R88 by AEA. And it's a stereo ribbon, so we put that right in the middle of the drum set, almost the exact same placement, so they're kind of both picking up the same picture almost. the Coles were a little wider, but let me let you hear that, and then I'll kind of flip back and forth between the two mics. So here are the RD8, and I might need to bring down just a tidge just to compare apples and apples, but let's check that out. RD8 as overheads. So once again, nice smoothness that a ribbon is going to give you. The one thing I would say I didn't necessarily like about the R88 on this particular placement was it wasn't as even as the Coles to me. So let me just kind of go back and forth between the mics and see if you agree with me. For instance, the snare drum comes out a little bit more, that kind of stuff. And if that's what you want, that's great. I preferred the flatter response of the Coles on this, and I own the RD8, so there you go, figure. You always want something different, right? So let's check out the Coles versus the RD8. So I'm just going to leave these soloed, and then I'm going to switch over. I mean, both are really great. I really don't have any complaints. It's just in this particular setup, I was digging the Coles more. Let me explain some of these mics we did. You saw in the intro that I'll kind of get these all in the same place. These three mics that are kind of doing some color stuff. In fact, let's move the color mics all down here and let's talk about those all real quick, because these to me are also color mics. We did some techniques that we had enough channels to try out, so we said, what the heck, let's try it out. These mics, at least all of these three mics, the bald mic, alt bald, trash, are all very squished through an 1176. These are a little bit compressed, and I'll talk about that here in a minute. In fact, we need to call that a wall mic there. We'll switch it to closet mic, but this is a particular wall mic we did. So the bald mic, let me explain that real quick. Joe Baldridge, a technique that he uses that a student told me about. Basically, it's a small diaphragm condenser, KM84, somewhere around the low tom pointing towards the entire drum set, or pointing towards the snare drum, rack tom area, and really compressed. So let me show you what that particular mic did or does with that going on. So kind of getting a lot of high-end, compressed high-end. Hat, snare, but especially hat, I'm hearing. Let's go with the alt bald now. And a few other things I don't know if I mentioned. Eb is a lefty. That shouldn't matter, but if you're looking at the intro video on how we set all this up, that might matter as far as where we place the mics. But in general, the bald mic is by the floor tom pointing towards the snare drum / rack tom. This particular technique is one of my techniques that I've been using for a long time. We called it the alt bald. I could call it the Dave Tuff mic too. It's an RE20. It's on the more of the front of the kit, about 2 feet high, pointing in the hi-hat snare drum area, but about 2 feet in front of the hi-hat snare drum, pointing towards the entire drum kit, if that makes any sense. Once again, really compressed, so let's listen to that. RE20 large diaphragm, or mid to large diaphragm dynamic. So it actually is almost the, well, I'm going to say the opposite of the bald mic, but the bald mic seems to give us just more high frequencies, where this mic is kind of upper mids with that little slap on the kick and all that. Okay, cool, got all that. And then the trash mic, which all of these technically are trash mics because they're all overly compressed. We had a SM57 about 5 feet in front of the kit, about waist level. Once again, overly compressed, pointing at the drum set. Nice sound there. Maybe a little bit too much hi-hat, but a lot more room. A lot more room sound in there because it was in front of the drum kit, so you're going to get more room. I'm going to skip over to round 2 and let you hear the 121. That's actually the one I preferred as the trash front mic, only because it didn't have as much hi-hat. Like if you listen to SM57 once again, a lot of hi-hat there. But if we go over to the R121 Royer Ribbon, different groove, obviously. Still a lot of hi-hat, but just more even in general. So if I had to pick between the two that I liked, I would go with the R121 there. A couple other experiments we tried on this first round. It was a this first round was a wall mic. So I'm going to put round 1 wall mic. Round 2, 3 closet mic. So we just were experimenting with stuff, and that would be the wall mic. First was a mic that was probably I'd say 8 feet up, pointed towards the far wall from the drum set. It was a wooden wall. So let's listen to what that particular mic did. And it sounds like a mic miking the wall. I don't know what else to tell you. And then floor mic, which we did here, was we took a U87, pointed it like 6 feet from the floor, once again, far wall from the drum set towards the floor, some, 15, 20 feet in front of the drum set, right towards the floor in a cardioid pattern. So a lot of low end. So the thing I dug about that is if you were looking for the 3 frequency ranges, that mic gives us the top. That guy kind of gives us more of the upper mids, and that kind of gives us the lower mid / upper lows, and you could mix all 3 of those together. So before I move on to just playing all the mics in conjunction, I wanted to show you a technique that I've been using lately, and it's using a plugin by Sound Radix or Sound Radix, however you want to call it, called Auto Align. I've fallen in love, like a lot of other folks, with this particular plugin. And let me just go ahead and show it to you, and then I'll open up a new session with the plugin on there, because it usually takes some time to set up. But if you go, typically it falls under Other. And this bad boy, it's really not that much money. I think it's a couple $100. But what it does is it takes an input. So in this case, I'm going to use the overhead as my input. One of the overheads by the snare drum, since that's my loudest instrument in this case with the overheads. And I'm going to make sure I have a good input level. So I'll just make sure it's reading that. So let's go ahead and make sure it's reading it. And you can actually solo it if you want to. Just go ahead and solo that. Oops, forgot that they were grouped. So we're getting a nice level. That's totally cool. -6. So that's awesome. So then on that particular thing, I'm going to say I'm going to send on channel 1. It's kind of like a send and receive function. And then let's take the snare drum. Technically we should go through and do all of these, which takes the time. But once again, I'll put auto align there on that. And then because I was sending on that one on these and every other consecutive version of auto align and all the other tracks, I'm going to receive on channel 1. So at least if that's my reference point, which I'm using as my reference point, I'm going to receive on channel 1. So this one's sending and all the others are going to be receiving on channel 1. And what you're going to see now is that new thing coming in there on the side chain. Make sure it has a good input. And it does. So that's beautiful. And then what we're going to do is we're going to detect the polarity between those two. Okay. Because they're hitting the mics at different times and then being summed, it could cause a phase issue, right? So we're going to check that. We can check delay or delay and polarity. Let's go ahead and do delay and polarity. Why not? We paid good money for this. Might as well use all the features, right? So I'm going to go ahead and click detect after I'm playing it. And make sure I have that soloed. Well, I'm not even sure if I need to have the snare drum soloed, but let's go ahead and do it just to be safe. Let's try that one more time. Okay, so we didn't necessarily need us to solo the snare drum, but what it's telling me is we have a delay of 108 milliseconds, a pretty sizable delay from when he's hitting the snare drum and the sound wave is going to the snare drum mic versus when it's actually getting to the overhead mic. So you would go through on every track, like I said, and auto align it, and so that's what I've done on this particular session. I'll see if you guys think it makes a difference. So I won't say anything before, and I'll just play it with and without auto align. Yeah, let's go ahead and save that and move it on to the auto align session. So now I have the auto align instance on every track here. Once again, no EQ, no compression, unless we're talking about those trash mics. And let's start without auto align, and then I'll throw it in as you see these light up. I'll throw it in, and you can make the call if you think it makes a difference. So here we go. Okay, so in some circumstances you might not want to use auto align, and I should mention that if you want your room mics to be delayed, but overall, to me it brings the kit a little bit more in focus. I'd have to actually mix the kit a little bit more, but like even in those examples I just played, if you listen to the snare drum, for instance, listen how it becomes a little bit more in focus. So cool little tool there. So anyway, what I wanted to do is throw auto align on, so after we have that on, we can try different combinations. So let's go ahead and just do that and then call it a day on this particular round. So what I'm going to do is get a decent balance between these elements here. So then I'm going to skip the toms. I'm going to show you what our overheads are doing with those two combinations. So I'm going to switch once again between the Coles and the R88. So here are I think the R88 was just a little hotter, so I'm going to make sure I turn that down. Here are the Coles with our kick and snare. R88. Coles. Okay, cool. So both are great options. I'll go with the Coles for now. The only other thing we haven't talked about is the room mic configuration that we used. And I picked these up from Blackbird just to try out here in Nashville. And they're called the SOM 50s. Maybe a company called Ashman Acoustics, I believe. And they're supposed to be a recreation, an affordable recreation of the Neumann M50s. M50s, gosh, probably go for what, 20, 25 a mic, 25 grand a mic nowadays. So it's just for anybody doing a budget project or a home studio project, it's not going to be a possibility. But these guys are actually $700 for the pair. Supposedly they behave omnidirectionally like M50 would. Depending on the frequency, they're more omnidirectional or less omnidirectional. You can read about them. But overall, I like the mics for the price range. And so this is what we used for our rooms. We kind of spaced it out, wide in the room. And let me just let you hear these guys now. I'll keep everything the same there and then bring in the room mics. I might high pass these if I was mixing, but no high passing, no compression or anything on the room mics. So I'll play it without them and then bring them in. So just a nice big room sound, and I really dug those. Like I said, for the price range, definitely. So now what I'll do is just kind of play with some of these color mics. I'll throw them in. You can decide if you like them. Once again, this was not a closet mic on this session. This was a wall mic pointing towards the wall. So I'll go ahead and relabel it here. I'll just kind of throw these in as we go along, and you'll be able to hear the variations. Cool. So let's do a little bit more of that floor mic. Okay, so if depending on the song, if it was me, I'd probably go with either the alt bald mic or the bald mic, and then if I wanted something a little bit darker, go add that floor mic in. So overall, a lot of options you can see when you have a lot of inputs for your drums. So now let's just listen to the whole drum kit as a whole and play it. And I might go ahead and turn. I didn't leave the hi-hat mic on, by the way, on that last take, just because I thought the overheads picked it up in a nice fashion. So what I'm going to do now is just kind of play the whole drum kit so you can hear it. I will go ahead and this time let's go with the R88. Listening through, let's pick the bald mic, get rid of the trash mic, get rid of these guys, and just listen to it. And we'll go to the end. So I hope you enjoyed this episode of Dave's Ways. Hope you guys had fun during this week's episode of Dave's Waves, and I hope to see you next time.